Hey everyone, welcome to episode 8 of The Photo Show. My name is Brian Matiash. This is the very first Facebook Live show that is dedicated to photography and video and the tech surrounding it. Today is Friday the 13th, month of May 2016. I'm really happy to have you guys here. So I was kind of going back and forth. I had this topic on my mind since the beginning of the week, but I want to let it, I guess, macerate a bit and see what happened specifically around an acclaimed photographer, Steve McCurry, who is most probably known for his photo called The Afghan Girl. It was, I think, by National Geographic rated as the most recognizable photo in the history of photography. And you can see right here that's Steve McCurry with his photo of the Afghan girl, and it's just kind of like a legendary photo. Now, earlier this week, an Italian, I don't know if he's a photographer, but an Italian person went, and his name is Paolo Viglione. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He went to an exhibit that had Steve McCurry's photos, some of them from Cuba, and I'm gonna just jump in here and show you specifically what I'm talking about. So this is the photo here. Oops, let me turn mine. There. All right, so that's the photo, and just from looking at it, you wouldn't necessarily think anything of it, right? It's a cool photo. It's balanced beautifully in terms of the placement of the people in the foreground and the two cars, the kind of classic cars that Cuba is so kind of, I guess, famous for, if that's the right word. And so I never would have, I mean, if I was at an exhibit, I never would have thought about looking at that closely. I don't know how close you were able to get. Like, I know, for instance, with the Mona Lisa, you can't get close to it at all. But Paolo kind of noticed something that bothered him. And when you kind of zoom into that area, you can see that some weird things are starting to happen. Specifically, when you zoom into this guy here, there's this really kind of poor cloning job, and it looks like the whoever edited the photo, because it wasn't Steve McCurry, it's not uncommon for photographers to, or some photographers, of a certain, I guess, depending on how long they've been in the industry or how busy they are or whatever, to relegate the editing to their relegate the editing to a post-processing team or a developer or something like that. So, this really kind of sparked all sorts of outrage, and you had a bunch of kind of sensationalized quotes, by photo blogs and stuff like that. But I want to actually commend F-Stoppers. If you go to F-Stoppers and see their article, I felt like that was well done. It was titled well, and it was somewhat objective. But this made me question or bring up what are the responsibilities of a photographer today? Now, obviously, if you're a photojournalist, for example, you're commissioned as a photojournalist, or you're going out kind of on spec to do your own photojournalism work, where the objective is to faithfully capture and replicate something that's happening in real life as it's happening. In those situations, I think it's pretty common, or it's an accepted understanding that very basic things like some dodging and burning, and maybe a little bit of contrast control, and I think removing like scratches, I'm not sure, are okay. But doing anything beyond that, I think it goes against the grain, the nature of journalism, photojournalism. So in those respects, yes, absolutely. If this was kind of meant for, Time magazine, a piece on Cuba that was meant to accurately and faithfully, showcase or display life in Cuba, that would be a problem. But in terms of, for example, fine art photography, now you're starting to get into some, I guess, gray water. Is water gray? Gray area? Murky water? I don't know what the analogy should be. But, there was an interview done with Steve McCurry, and in the situation here, let's kind of go back to the photo in question. And then specifically, we'll kind of bring it up here. Steve said to the effect of that in all his time when he was commissioned to go to all different parts of the world and photograph different situations, environments, and cultures, yes, those were, he took the photos and they're as is. And the way the interview was done in Italian, so the way Google translated it, he took responsibility. He said, yep, this was, in my lab, and he was going to look into what happened here. But he did say that this photo was part of kind of his own personal work, that wasn't where he was kind of attributing himself as a visual storyteller. So when you look at a photo like this one, maybe things like the amount of color boost that was added, and other kind of like adding more texture to the photo might not have been fair game in a photojournalistic sense. And then definitely something like the issue here with just the really sloppy cloning tools, or the cloning job, that just kind of is, that would definitely not fly. But it begs the question. So what Steve McCurry said in the interview was he was traveling. He wasn't even here when this happened, and he didn't see it. So, all right, imagine you're Steve McCurry, all right? You are the guy. You are like, you've taken one of the most visually identifiable photos in the world. If it were me, if I were Steve McCurry and I were handing off photos to an editor or a stylist to touch up, a retoucher, I mean, I would make sure, if I was that retoucher, I would probably, game over for me. I would quit. I would never touch another photo again, because just looking, and now I'm just being kind of critical of the retoucher, not necessarily with Steve McCurry, because we're running with the assumption that he was in his visual storyteller mode, which he kind of elaborates, gives him more creative freedom. And I agree with that 100%. But as a retoucher, to not catch that, not be able to recreate. The problem was, if you kind of look at the photo again, that they were trying to move the person. They wanted to make separation between the pedestrian and the sign. But the problem was that the sign was probably blocking the person's foot. Just going to bring it up here again so we could look more closely. But actually, let's bring this one up. So the person's right foot was never visible. Like, it never existed in the photo. So there would be, it'd be kind of hard to recreate that. There are ways. I mean, he could have easily cloned or sampled the left foot. And just kind of adjusted it. It's not very difficult, in my opinion. I don't have access to the full-res photo, so I'm not going to, try to cast too much judgment. But overall, if you Google Steve McCurry Photoshop and go to the Google image searches, there are actually some photos, this photo where someone actually marked up all the different, it wasn't just this, that man wasn't the only offending part of the photo in terms of the manipulation. There were several areas where, like, the bricks in the building, the pattern totally did not match up. And these are in terms of cloning, that's like cloning 101. Making sure that patterns match up, making sure that textures are the same. So if you're cloning, say, an area that's texture rich, you don't kind of have a section that's kind of muddy or smooth, and you know, the reciprocal of that. If you're texturing or if you're cloning, say, water or a sky, you don't have some weird kind of differentiating textures. It has to be convincing if you're going to do, like, if you're going to play the game, you know, play with your A game. That's just the way it is. I've always said that. If you're going to be doing kind of fine local editing, make sure you're doing the best job you can. So going beyond that, there are other issues. So what happened, as well as, you know, it so often happens with once one thing happens, or, you know, one Photoshop flub is caught, people started looking at others from Steve McCurry, and so he started getting other images of his started getting put under a microscope. And so you see this photo right here, and this is the original, but in terms of what was published, here is what was published. So you can see that there was some clear editing. Now, what I'm not sure of is, again, I'll just show you here's the original. Notice the gentleman in between the two guys on the bicycle, and then notice the kind of color of the guy in the front pushing the bike, as well as the wheels of the wagon in the background. Actually, the wagon itself in the background, watch, they go away. So this was clearly manipulated, and what I'm not sure of is if this was a piece that was meant as, you know, photojournalism, then there's a problem. But if it's simply a fine art piece, and if anyone has an idea, I would love to know. Obviously, please feel free to leave your questions or your comments on the post. And then there was this other one that was leaked. So you've got a bunch of kids playing, and what I want you to pay attention to is you see the kid in the foreground, kind of on the left. Pay attention to the kid right behind him. In the finalized photo, that kid was digitally removed. And for the most part, it was done well, in my opinion. So let's just kind of do that one more time. Here's the original. And then aside from some color boosts and tonal adjustments, they physically, or I guess digitally, removed one of the people. So again, if it's me here, in terms of, we're asking the question of what the responsibility of the photographer is to their craft and to the audience, because you actually do have, you know, if you're trying to share, and especially if you fancy yourself or you see yourself as an authority or just kind of a respected figure, I guess are the best words that are coming to mind in photography, then I would say that there is a responsibility that you have to your audience based on the intent. So if the intent is photojournalism, you know, kind of, you've built a reputation as a photojournalist, then I think it's a fair assumption for your audience to make that your work is going to adhere to the standards of a photojournalist in terms of the integrity of the shot. Now, there are people, you know, I believe that no photo is ever truly fully, I guess, a full or accurate representation of a scene, just by virtue of the fact that the process of developing or exposing a photo on film, the process of a camera sensor capturing the light, and then using software that was built by engineers to encode that, whether it's even a raw file, is still subject to the manufacturer's own algorithms, and especially a JPEG. So just by pressing the button, you're altering reality. But that's kind of, that argument is boring. You know, that's getting into a very kind of myopic way of seeing things. What I'm talking about are these kinds of infractions of altering things. So as Steve McCurry, yes, I think it's fair to hold him to a certain standard where when you see these photos, you're kind of running with the assumption that these photos are authentic. or at least the presentation of them was as it was happening. So does that mean though that that Steve McCurry cannot kind of veer away from that or explore a different avenue? And I think that's absolutely ridiculous to think that he can't. One of the wonders of being a creative photographer is being able to explore all the kind of creative freedoms that you have with technology. God, how many times has someone postured, if Ansel Adams was alive, would he use Photoshop? Like, Ansel Adams used, the zone system and dodging and burning all the time. And he didn't do it necessarily just to kind of create, an appropriate exposure. He did it for dramatic purposes. Like, of course, I would say, yeah, Ansel Adams would use Photoshop. I think a visual storyteller, as Steve McCurry kind of called himself, should fully embrace the tools at their disposal. Like, why would you not? I think that kind of is kind of sad and tragic, in my opinion, to say, oh well, I can only take a photo this way. Go for it. But don't say that that's the only thing you can do, or especially hold that standard onto other people, especially even if it's Steve McCurry, kind of a legendary photographer. They should have that opportunity just as much as everyone else. So let me just here, Karthik, I'm going to the questions or the comments on the post here. Karthik says, I would like to be a responsible photographer, but I am unable to go out and explore the world around me. Can you give me some advice for budding photographers like me? Okay, so Karthik, I'll cover that afterwards because I don't want to deviate too far. It's a totally fair question. It's a very important question. But let me kind of finish this stuff up and then I'll kind of talk about your thing. Rude, you said, I think so. Yes, I think so. What do you mean by that? Just because the comment, I didn't get the comment as I was speaking, so I want to know what you mean by that. So I'm going to kind of put some wood behind the arrow and kind of speak to my own experiences. So this just, and I'm speaking, obviously biased, but I would say that this photo of mine is possibly my most famous, if that's the word. Like, this photo has gone everywhere. It's been licensed, and it's definitely one of my favorite photos that I took. And let me just show you the original. So this is the original photo straight out of camera, taken years ago. And look, I took this photo. I wasn't commissioned to take the photo for anyone. This is the Royal Clipper. That's the name of the boat. And at the time, I don't know if it still is. It was the world's largest square-rigged sailing vessel. And I had the privilege of living on it for 2 weeks. This was my home for 2 weeks as we sailed around the coast of Italy. But notice, so the captain of the ship only let the press, and I was considered press on the ship, one time in 2 weeks to go on a little boat and photograph it. None of the other passengers were allowed to. And this was the only time in 2 weeks that he brought down the sails. The rest of the time, the sails were kind of wound up in their little cases. Notice in the middle, if you look, there were two sails that were at the time broken. They didn't come out. So when we go to the finalized photo, obviously there are some split toning effects added, and then I digitally inserted a sun flare because I liked the way it looked. But I also reproduced the two sails. Again, let's just kind of go back here. There are the two sails missing in the middle, and then, but to me that looked like a gap tooth. Like, that's just like, I couldn't have that. So, oh yeah, rude, I just saw your thing, Ansel using Photoshop. Totally. So, I consider myself a visual storyteller, and yeah, I'm going to use any tool at my disposal to get to a place where I'm excited about the photo, because when I'm excited about the photo, I'm excited to share the photo. So, here's another photo, slightly less work done, but I want to illustrate how creatively this was a photo taken in Abandon Beach in Oregon, and the finalized photo, I mean, again, more split toning, but I also used software to digitally manipulate the plane of focus to simulate a shallow depth of field, so that the stack in the foreground really pops off. So, you know, going back to the original, it was a very overcast day, which was perfect for the type of photography I was going for. But I wanted to kind of simulate a shallow depth of field. So, again, if we're gonna call a spade, I think it's only fair to call that in proper context. If I was hired by Nat Geo Traveler to take a photo of the Royal Clipper, and I did those things, I would be ashamed of myself. I would never do it as a photojournalist. But I don't fancy myself a photojournalist. I don't want to. Even my street photography, when I'm visiting another country, or even just when I'm walking around Portland, if I'm in the mindset of capturing life as it happens, I'm gonna capture it and then edit it the way I want. If there's a pole that's obstructing kind of what would be a better shot, you can be damn sure I'm gonna remove it. But unlike the retoucher, I'm gonna do my absolute best to make it, you know, faithfully removed. The work that this retoucher did for Steve McCurry, that's the story right there. Totally. I mean, let's put aside assuming that his photojournalistic work is authentic and, you know, representative. I don't want to go down that road. Let's talk about his visual storytelling kind of photos, that he's giving those up, which in a way also I find kind of ironic. So you're saying in one hand that you're a visual storyteller and you have the creative freedoms to express your photos in different ways beyond the boundaries and ethics of photojournalism, but you still take those photos and you give them to someone else to you know, creatively express itself. So that's one thing that was always bothering me about this whole story, is like, I don't know, you're kind of like, you're giving up control of one of the best parts of being a visual storyteller, and that's the post-processing and digital stylization. But then there's the story of the retoucher, who I would love to hear more from. Like, I would love to know what the workflow is, what the chain of command was. How did no one find that? You know, it took one kind of attendee of a gallery exhibit to look closely to find this out and spark this whole thing. So, oh yeah, Deb. So Deb's bringing up an example. I don't know if I can get it in time, but it was a diner in South Boston. I think it was a South Street diner, where I went to town on that photo in terms of how I edited it. But yeah, I don't know. I just don't see. I would never. I don't like saying blanket statements like that. I would like to think that if I ever somehow reached the stature of Steve McCurry, and I was conscientiously going out to shoot as a visual storyteller, you know, and as Rick said, you know, digital art, I would never hand over control of the post-processing phase to another person. To me, that's like basically saying, okay, I want a photo of, you know, Steve goes out with another photographer and it's like, okay, I want to capture this here, dial in the settings and press the button. That's how high in regard I hold the post-processing phase. It's just as impactful as the composition phase itself, the point of the time of exposure, because that's just another time or another phase of the kind of life cycle of a photo that you can really have your own creative influence as a visual storyteller. And to abdicate that to someone else, it just doesn't make sense. If you're too busy to do it, then do what all other photographers do and amass a backlog. And when you're ready and you want to put together kind of a show on your photos from Cuba, well then devote some time and do it. I don't know, that to me just doesn't sit well. And maybe because I didn't grow up in that era of Magnum photographers and, you know, these photographers who have studios and assistants and this kind of stuff. I could never give that up. And you know, that it reminds me of kind of my wife, Nicole, not with her photography, but with her business. Like, she is so busy every day doing every single thing for her business. And I can appreciate that because I'm doing that for my business. Like, every single thing, creating the graphics, creating the marketing, creating the newsletters, maintaining partnerships. And then, of course, still finding time to go out and shoot and edit photos and share every day with our audiences. And she could, you know, we talk about this all the time, she could just never bring herself, even though she wants to find an assistant to do more of the administrative stuff, a big part of our success, her, you know, mutually exclusive, is the kind of personal touch that, you know, we infuse in everything we do. So everything I do is done by me. And there is a common thread that's woven through everything. And over time, because you can't rush it, over time, your audience picks up on that. So, you know, bringing it back to the photography as a visual storyteller, I just couldn't hand that off. Hey, James. James says, nailed this excellently with the word intent. The difficulty that all photographers, creative or journalistic, want the image to look as good as it can. In that respect, my opinion is any level of manipulation by the content creator is acceptable as long as the image doesn't tell a lie. So don't remove something where the removal changes the story. So that's kind of a, you know, I get what you're saying there, James, but it's the intent, right? So if the intent is journalism, no, you know, removing something changes the story, even if it affects the overall composition, the balance, and the weight of the photo. You can't do that. But as a visual storyteller, you know, as a photographer, with these digital tools, doing these, you know, creating these photos for myself, sometimes the story, in order for me to tell the story, I do need to manipulate it. Whether that's going so far as, you know, replacing the sky or simulating a fast-moving clouds, which I can do very easily. As the way that I see it is, okay, here's how I see it, just to kind of illustrate, taking the example of replacing the sky and simulating a long exposure with the clouds. Let's say there is a photo I take, I mask out the sky, I drop in a sky with clouds, and then I apply a very strong motion blur to that layer so the clouds are essentially stretched. And that does give a kind of a, if you do it well and the mask is clean, that does give a really authentic simulation of long exposure. But let's say in that photo, in the foreground there is a body of water. Well, depending on the characteristic of the water, if your shutter speed was fast and the water is kind of frozen in place, that can't work. Because if you're putting a long exposure of the sky, you're kind of giving the sense that the exposure was taken over n number of seconds. Then by that same principle, the water should be more smooth, if not glassed out. And so these are the types of things, as I go into, you know, that rabbit hole, that's what I look for, are these consistencies. Like, all right, if I replace the sky with, you know, fast-moving clouds, and there are a bunch of flowers and reeds and grass, and they're all perfectly static, that's a problem as well. That is not, for me, I abandon that. Then I'm like, okay, this doesn't work. But if I'm out shooting and it's a gray sky, and I take the long exposure, meaning I take the long exposure and you get the movement of the grass and you get the movement in the water, but the sky there's no sky, then yes, I can remove the sky, put in a bluer sky with clouds, and both components jive with each other in terms of laws of, I guess, physics and time. So yeah, I'm all for manipulating the photo, but with a certain amount of care. Obviously that the quality of the manipulation is good, but also that you adhere to different kind of laws of physics and placement. So yeah, that's kind of that. So I think I've covered, I think I got all the questions. I hate that Facebook isn't showing me things, at least in this view, in order. All right, so let's go back to, we'll wrap things up with Karthik's question. Actually, his question is kind of meaty enough to warrant its own show. But again, to go back, it says, I would like to be a responsible photographer, but I am unable to go out and explore the world around me. Can you give me some advice for budding photographers like me? So I guess first it depends on where you live. If you live in a kind of an isolated area where there's no one around you, you live on a farm somewhere, then I firmly believe that the hallmark of any photographer is to find a photo wherever they are, and that's kind of a woo-woo statement, but I wholeheartedly believe it. I punish myself. I kind of get upset at myself when the thought, there's nothing here to photograph, comes in my mind. I really get upset at that because I don't believe that at all. So yeah, find things that are, I guess, unique. It's very hard without knowing where you live. But if you live in kind of a rural or an urban area, even if it's not like dependent, even if it's kind of more run down, there's tons. In fact, I would say there are more opportunities to photograph in more of a kind of rundown area than kind of a developed area. Like, I would much rather shoot in Detroit than in New York City, just because I find there to be so much more interesting stuff to shoot. So, as advice as a budding photographer, just keep shooting. I mean, there's really, you have to be okay with getting rid of that statement that there's nothing to shoot, because I mean, I don't know what kind of photography you do, so that's kind of that. I think that's it. I don't see any other comments. So yeah, I hope that I really enjoyed this segment. It begs a lot of questions, and I would love to know what you think. So if you're watching the recording, please leave your comments, because we can have this dialogue afterwards. And you can find me basically everywhere on social. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and YouTube. Just go to those/Brian Matiash and you'll find me there. And yeah, stay tuned for the show next week, Monday. We're gonna talk about preparations for travel photography, because that was a question that was asked in my Facebook group, Evolve Your Eye. So yeah, for now, enjoy your Friday the 13th, everyone. Thank you for joining me and have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.